All right, here we go. Good morning, folks. Almost afternoon here in Washington. Thank you so much for tuning into this session. This one is all about trends in the illicit drug market. For those who are tuning in for the first time today, my name is Alex Sorofsky. I'm one of the public health educators with the Washington Poison Center. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this session. Before I do, though, I do want to have a quick reminder. You are all muted the way you're viewing this stream through Whova. So please ask questions, leave comments as you have them in the Whova chat box and Q&A box. I'll be monitoring those throughout, and then I will field any questions when our speakers are ready for them. All right, so let me introduce our speakers today. We have Amanda Dutt, who is a public health analyst with the CDC Foundation on the Overdose Response Strategy team for Washington State, where she focuses on data sharing and innovative collaborations to address and reduce opioid overdoses. We also have Tim Halvorsen, who is a supervisory intelligence research specialist for the Drug Enforcement Administration office in Seattle, Washington. And then finally, we have Mike Mizer, who is currently the drug intelligence officer and a member of the Overdose Response Strategy team at Northwest HIDTA. Thank you, you three all, for being here, and I will pass it over to you. We can get your slides up and running, and then I'll turn my camera off.
Alrighty, 1 second, and then if anyone can't see or hear us, yeah, just let us know. But with that, I'll kick us off. Thanks for the intros, Alex. We're really happy to be here today, and we're going to talk a little bit about trends in the illicit drug market. So yeah, just a quick federal acknowledgement for funding purposes. And then a little background just to ground us. I'm not sure who on the call maybe has heard of Northwest HIDTA or HIDTAs in general, but for those of you who don't know, HIDTA stands for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. It's a federally funded grant program intended to disrupt the illicit drug market and support both safety and public health partners. Here at Northwest HIDTA, we're based in Seattle, but we serve all of Washington State. We kind of have 3 main branches at Northwest HIDTA. The first is going to be our law enforcement drug task forces. And we have 19 of those. They're not in every county, but we're kind of represented in some of the most populous counties. Then we have our investigative support center, which Tim, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so one of the things that HIDTA does is facilitate intelligence sharing and investigative support, so supporting criminal investigations that are going on. And I have a group of about 7 analysts and officers that do that for law enforcement agencies throughout the state, focusing on the task forces that we support financially.
Yeah, and so then our last is going to be prevention and treatment. So we have, I think, 15, 16 prevention and treatment grantees statewide. And then the Overdose Response Strategy team, which is Mike and myself. So a little bit about that. Like I said, I'm a public health analyst on the team. And the ORS is a nationwide initiative between HIDTA and the CDC Foundation to kind of bridge that gap between public health and public safety. When we're talking about, the drug market and individuals who use drugs, both public health and public safety interact with that population in different ways, and we kind of have different interventions and data sources. So we're really here to facilitate kind of information sharing across those sectors. Mike and I also do a quarterly drug trends report where we publish updates to what's happening in the market, and then we also use OD-MAP to track overdoses near real time as possible. So that's a little bit about us, what we do. Diving into drug trends, I just want to take a moment to kind of speak a little bit about methodology in terms of the data that we have. When we're talking about the drug market and then also overdoses, we kind of have to piece together multiple sources of information or data streams, so to speak, to kind of get a sense of what's happening. So in terms of the illicit market, that might be drug seizure data, crime lab toxicology data, community drug checking programs. When we're looking at overdoses, that might just be kind of like DOH data. EMS data is a really big one for kind of looking at non-fatal numbers, and then other sources like OD-MAP to track overdoses in near real time. And then a big one for Mike and I, and it's incorporated a lot into this presentation, is just qualitative interviews that we do with our partners. Like I said, we have 19 enforcement task forces statewide, and then 16 prevention and treatment grantees. So we reach out to them on a very regular basis to say like, hey, what are you seeing? What's in the supply? But then also, what are the people you work with telling you? What are people in recovery saying? Kind of what's happening on the streets. That's a really rich information source that we rely on heavily. And then just to ground us a little bit more as well, there's not a lot of like large scale efforts to kind of track the amount of drug users there are, or kind of the financial burden of it. There have been a couple. So one of them, the United Nations Drug Trend Report, is a really rich resource that we use a lot. I think they have their 2024 report out now. And they kind of did an effort to quantify the amount of individuals who use drugs worldwide. And they estimated about 316 million people use drugs in the past year worldwide. And I think that was maybe 2024, which is a lot, right? And then looking at kind of the financial aspect of it, they estimated probably $500 billion worldwide as kind of the scope of the industry for the illicit drug market. Looking specifically at the US, 2016 is the last time they kind of quantified that, and they estimated about $146 billion a year was the industry in the US. So that's about 0.8% of our national GDP. In 2015 to 2018, they estimated maybe $13 billion was going into Mexico from basically drug sales in the US. That's a lot, right? In 2018, so that's even before kind of the crux or the really big ramping up of our fentanyl epidemic. So we can imagine those numbers were even higher. Alrighty, so diving right in kind of to our first, big drug that we've been contending with for quite some time, fentanyl. Our main trends that we've seen over the past year and a half have just been a lot of variation in fentanyl, and then also cocaine, which I'll get to later. So kicking off with purity, with fentanyl, this has just varied so much. For a long time, the kind of, record, or it was stated that 2 milligrams was like a lethal dose. And so that would be a lethal dose for, any of us sitting here who are opioid naive, but for someone who's using a lot, not so much. But pretty consistently, the average pill purity that we saw was about 2 milligrams. However, there have been recent reports of decreases in that. And then, last year we had periods where there were pills that were much lower than that and maybe had no fentanyl at all when the market was particularly volatile. In terms of powder, we typically see around 15% purity in fentanyl powder in Washington. That varies a lot. And that's obviously a big decrease from the purity that we see at the southwest border when fentanyl is coming into the country. Typically at the border, powder purity might be around 49%. So we work very closely with King County Medical Examiner's Office, and they are kind of able to periodically test the purity of samples that contributed to fatal overdoses in King County. And so from the data that they've shared with us, we've seen purity range as low as 2%, sometimes 0, up to 89%, and sometimes into the 90% for those samples, which obviously is an enormous overdose risk. Purity is often untested. It's really hard to be able to get that kind of compositional or quantitative testing done, and it takes a while. So individuals just don't know how strong their supply is, so to speak, and that puts them at a very heightened risk for overdose. Okay, so just a little bit of data. This comes from drug seizures from our law enforcement task forces. So those 19 task forces are making seizures on a regular basis, and we're able to see that data and just do kind of some basic analyzing of it to get a sense of trends. So on the left-hand side, this is going to be information just showing the kind of shift from pills to powder. We have it here as tablets, but that's, we mean pills by that. Powder fentanyl is by far the most common now, but for a while, kind of areas in Eastern Washington saw more pills than powder. And you can see that kind of gradually shift as powder is in orange right there. And around Q4 of 2024 is where in the data we finally saw that parity of pill and powder prevalence. And then Q1 of this year, powder finally eclipsed pills in terms of prevalence. And qualitatively, we've been hearing for people for a long time, especially in Western Washington, that powder was the most predominant form. Similarly, on the right-hand side, this is just going to show you the amount seized, whereas on the left, that was the number of seizures per form. So you can see that general increase in kilograms of powder seized over time. And then in Q1 of this year, we saw a doubling of the kilograms of powder seized. All right, fentanyl quality. Again, this is sort of our biggest trend. When I say that, what I mean is there's kind of been no consistent trend. It's been high amounts of variation. So mid 2024, I'd say summer, going into fall, we started to hear increased reports, both from the public safety side, but then also people working in treatment, and then people who are using drugs, of low quality fentanyl. And I mean that both in terms of purity and just the quality. This was for both pills and powder. So that was kind of happening in 2024. And those of you, who might work in this field will know 2024 was also a banner year for overdose rates, right? Like starting in 2024 is when we saw that plateauing and then decreasing in ODs, both locally and nationwide. So while that was amazing news, I think some of us were a little uncertain what was driving that decrease. And, there's a number of factors that contributed to it for sure. But one possible one is just kind of the decrease in purity and strength of the fentanyl supply that was around. So we had this low quality purity in fentanyl in summer, and this happened alongside an increase in BTMPS. I have a slide on it, so we'll talk a little bit more about it, but this is an industrial chemical. It's not a drug that was proliferating in the fentanyl supply kind of overnight, kind of suddenly, and maybe late June, I want to say. Multiple states saw BTMPS in their fentanyl. Again, no one was really certain what it was doing there, but it was certainly there in substantial amounts in many places. In winter, we kind of saw the dropping off of BTMPS, although it's still a little bit here and there. And kind of a return to normal levels of quality. And then in 2025, it's really just been a lot of frequent dips and valleys in both reports of fentanyl quality and then also overdose fluctuations. There's certain areas in Washington, Yakima being one of them, King County, where we just saw a lot of up and down movement in rates of overdose, oftentimes happening alongside the changes that we're hearing qualitatively about the fentanyl supply. So this is something that's also hard to get in front of, right? I mean, if we don't really know what's driving it, we don't exactly know how to intervene. We just know that the fentanyl supply is just very volatile right now, and that's going to have direct consequence on overdose rates. Alrighty, getting into cocaine, I would say this is kind of the second biggest, proper trend we've been seeing over the last year and a half alongside fentanyl instability. One statistic we have for this on the worldwide scale is that the amount of users from 2018 to 2013 went up to 19 to 25 million users of cocaine, and that's a conservative estimate. So, bare minimum, we've seen like a 6 million increase in users in that time frame, and that's 2023, 2024, 2025 are going to be even higher. So kind of like looking at a timeline, 2021, we saw decreased eradication of the coca plant, which led to increased production and it being a bumper crop in Colombia. Late 2023 is when we really started to see and hear about increases in cocaine across the state and nationwide. And 2023 also was an all-time high for cocaine production. And I would say, at the end of 2023, 2024, Mike and I constantly were hearing from all of our partners we work with, cocaine's everywhere. Cocaine is back. One thing we hear in Washington too with our partners is that, cocaine's really no longer just the younger, party-going, recreational, middle upper class drug that it once was. We're seeing increased cocaine use amongst a wide array of demographic groups. For coke, predominantly powder, cocaine base, this is crack, is seen in small amounts, but it's usually at the user level. So it's not being like produced as cocaine base or really distributed. It's going to be individual users that are kind of rocking it up, so to speak, for their personal use.
Right. And one thing I want to talk about is this matches what we're seeing as far as the prices. Our wholesale prices have dropped almost in half in the last year and a half to some of the lowest levels I've ever seen in working narcotics for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Our average street level purity for powder is going to be about 50 to 60%. Obviously, with all of these purities, it varies so much. And I think I said this earlier, but if we're getting our purity information from, medical examiner or coroner's office, the testing they're doing, you have to know that that's kind of skewed even stronger, right? Because they have access to samples that have killed people. Again, just some seizure data to ground us a little bit, kind of all over the place. We have both kilograms seized and the number of entries for certain areas in Washington, and just a really large increase in the amount of kilograms of cocaine seized in Q1 of this year. I mean, 253% is pretty large. A caveat with seizure data too, you have to kind of consider what's driving it. So it is possible that, we see large increases in cocaine because cocaine's become more of a topic, so to speak. And there's just more attention on it. Therefore, it becomes more of a priority. Sometimes that's a thing, but also we are just seeing a large increase in the prevalence and saturation of cocaine. Currently, average price per gram is about $79. I don't know how that compares to other Western states, but similar.
It's pretty similar. Our drug prices are very similar to, let's say, the Los Angeles area for most of our illicit drugs.
And we'll touch on this later, but a big thing to understand about drugs is just the trafficking routes. Coming out of Mexico into California and up the I-5 corridor is where we get our drugs. So a lot of times what we're seeing in the supply and changes and even price information is going to track very similar up along the I-5 corridor. Tim will get to that later though. Okay, so fentanyl and cocaine confusion. This has been a very big topic for us for a while. We've heard a lot of community reports and concerns surrounding kind of fentanyl being quote unquote laced into cocaine and as well as other substances too. I think there's been a general kind of fear that fentanyl is, laced into everything is something that we've heard quite a bit. I'm going to speak specifically to cocaine today because this is really a trend that we have identified. King County ME, I talk about them a lot. They're superstars. They did kind of a deep dive into fentanyl-related overdoses, and these are going to be fatal. And in King County, fentanyl-related overdoses amongst users that are historically and exclusively cocaine users. And so they identified, kind of an increase, a trend. It's definitely happening that these fentanyl-related ODs are happening in people that don't use fentanyl, right? And so I think this can speak to what we've been hearing a little bit, and this concern that fentanyl is laced into stimulants. And there's a number of possible explanations for why we're seeing this. First one is powder confusion. If you look at the image on the right, I mean, these samples of fentanyl are visually indistinguishable from the cocaine sample. They look really similar. So, it's not inconceivable that a user who gets maybe a small bag or a sample of white powder might not exactly know, what they have. And that can be both the user and the dealer level. I mean, maybe a street level dealer confusing the powder is possible as well. Another one is cross-contamination. So we like to remind people, dealers and people who are divvying these drugs up, they're cutting them, they're packaging them. They're kind of doing them all on one table, typically. They might be putting them in bags that have been reused. It's not, uncommon that there's cross-contamination or trace amounts of fentanyl that might get into, what's intended to be sold as cocaine. And again, if you're exclusively a stimulant user, you're opioid naive, you've never used fentanyl, it's not going to take a lot to kind of knock you out, so to speak. The main takeaway here that we kind of like to emphasize is we haven't had any confirmed reports of large scale mixing of opioids and cocaine at the wholesale level, which is to say from like the cartel perspective, the drug production perspective, there's no incentive nor is there indication that these are being mixed. And another thing to kind of remember too that I didn't put a slide on is polysubstance use. So polysubstance use is incredibly common. Majority of our overdoses are polysubstance ODs, which means users will kind of intentionally use both maybe an opioid and a stimulant, sometimes together, sometimes one right after another. So that kind of co-use at the user level can be, another thing that's leading to fentanyl related ODs. Go ahead.
One thing I'd like to also emphasize is it's an economic thing too, is our dealers don't want to kill their users or their buyers. So they're highly unlikely to mix fentanyl with cocaine. If I'm a cocaine dealer, I don't want to kill off my buyers or become known as an individual who's putting out bad coke. So to that point, you also have to remember this is a money-making adventure or money-making enterprise for all the dealers. So it comes really down to economics. You don't want to kill off your buyers.
Yeah, and this conversation is really important from like a public health perspective, right? Like if we hear community reports of, fentanyl laced into other substances, these kind of unique overdoses, it's our job to kind of ascertain what are the possible explanations for why this is happening. Do we have data to support it? And then how do we pivot and then develop kind of community-based initiatives and educational outreach to our users to say like, hey, this is possible, right? So one thing we're hoping to get off the ground is just some kind of OD prevention outreach surrounding, the visual confusion of cocaine powder and fentanyl powder to try to address maybe that potential explanation for these ODs.
And one other thing, getting a little off cocaine with regards to methamphetamine, we're not seeing that as well as any kind of mixture. We are looking at some possibilities of reports of possible stigma where methamphetamine users aren't reporting use of fentanyl because of stigma. So that's something we're also looking into.
Right, so we might have partners working in treatment that say, hey, I have someone who's only ever, used meth, but they're probably positive for fentanyl. Is fentanyl laced into meth? Probably not. Maybe there's just some stigma or some other reasons that they're not disclosing fentanyl use. Okay, just a quick kind of snapshot on another trend we're seeing with cocaine ODs. Again, King County ME, so this is going to be fatalities. But this is not just King County specific. This is statewide. However, the caveat there is not all counties kind of participate in their data collection. So they have a good coverage of counties, but this is intended to be kind of a statewide snapshot. So in cocaine involved fatal overdoses, you can see this like very kind of disproportionate burden experienced by the Black African American community of cocaine MDs. This is not something we expected to find. We do know that, cocaine base is more common with our Black African American community, but this group is experiencing cocaine overdoses at a much higher rate than any other demographic group. Similarly, I think we were surprised to see, and this is for a year-long period, kind of how much, a little bit older these ODs skewed. So age group 60 to 69 is our most, popular age group for cocaine involved fatalities. And they do kind of just skew a little bit older, especially when we talked about how previously the kind of connotation or demographic of a coke user is going to be in this age group right here. There's a lot of things that could go into this. This could just be people who were using, drugs for a long time. Cocaine, it's a stimulant. It could be kind of, cardiac events that maybe they just couldn't sustain that coke use anymore. We don't exactly know why, but it's an interesting finding. And then again, kind of informs any sort of OD prevention outreach we want to do, right? Because we know communities that are experiencing this burden higher than other ones that we want to target with our overdose prevention. Alrighty, so methamphetamine, we don't kind of get into this in terms of production, but we're going to talk about it now. And the reason I don't spend too much time on meth is because in terms of a trends perspective, the trends we've been seeing have been, variation in fentanyl and then also just cocaine increases. Meth is our most stable drug, so to speak. In Washington, it's kind of the second most prevalent illicit drug and the second most common substance contributing to overdose. I said this briefly earlier, but like the bulk of our overdoses, I shouldn't say the bulk, but a slight majority of our overdoses are going to be fentanyl and methamphetamine kind of polysubstance overdoses. This isn't really necessarily always been the case. This has been kind of a 10-year upward trend in overdoses related to meth that we've seen. So over the past decade, there's been a consistent increase in meth-related overdoses. It's our most consistent market. It's always available. It's always cheap. That's the case really statewide. And it's incredibly pure. So again, just for perspective, in 1998, average purity for meth was about 37%. And then around 2006, there was a ban on ephedrine, which was kind of a main ingredient for manufacturing meth. And then once that ban happened, we saw a transition to the P2P method, which is the most prevalent now. And it's a very efficient way to make highly pure meth. So the way we responded to meth previously, kind of inadvertently led to a change in manufacturing that then produced even higher purity meth. Washington has some of the purest methamphetamine outside of the Southwest border. So typically those states that are right on the Southwest border will have really high purity, but then all the way up here in the Northwest Washington, we have the highest as well, which, to be fair, purity everywhere is going to be kind of 95 to 98%. Most of the meth that's, coming out of Mexico is going to be with the industrialized P2P method. Again, very efficient, produces consistently high purity rate meth. And then our most common form is crystal. So briefly, just on some fillers and adulterants, our kind of filler substances are going to be what, DTOs and mid-level dealers as well are going to be kind of cutting the substances with to stretch them out and make them go farther. So for fentanyl pills, our big one's going to be acetaminophen. For fentanyl powder, mannitol, caffeine are really popular. For cocaine, caffeine as well, and lidocaine are our most common fillers. Encountered less frequently, xylazine. We've been talking about it for a while and for a good reason. It's not that prevalent, I would say, in the fentanyl supply. I think maybe at its peak, I want to say maybe 20 to maybe 25%. of fentanyl might have had xylazine in it, but recently it's been a lot lower. I would say under 10%. I've even seen some data that says 5% of fentanyl has xylazine in it currently. Xylazine was always a bit more common on the East Coast, but on the East Coast now, methamphetamine is kind of replacing xylazine in the supply. Ketamine, we don't see that often. Nitazines as well, not that often. There have been a few kind of scattered instances of nitazines over the past couple of years, but typically when they crop up, it's going to be individuals who are kind of like making their own supply and typically purchasing them off the dark web. But we're not seeing nitazines in kind of mass being, in the mass fentanyl supply here. Carfentanil, some isolated incidents. I'm going to get into that next, and then BTMPS. So BTMPS, for those of you who haven't heard of it, this is a very long chemical name that I would never try to pronounce. I've heard of BTMPS as well. Like I said previously, it's not a drug, but it was in the fentanyl. It's an industrial chemical that's used to prevent UV degradation in plastic. So from individuals who were using this supply last year, we heard kind of qualitative reports of a really strong chemical smell associated with it. Some people compared it to like the smell of bug spray, smell of plastic. Ingesting it's kind of what you would expect for maybe ingesting a lot of different toxic chemicals, nausea, vomiting, fainting, just all symptoms kind of associated with ingestion of a toxic chemical. Again, this proliferated very quickly in the supply summer of 2024 and in multiple states kind of on the western side of the US. So California, Arizona, they were all seeing it around the same time, which is like a good indicator that this was something that kind of the cartels were doing, manufacturing it in Mexico. One potential, explanation we've heard is a way to kind of bridge the gap and disruption of precursor flow. So, right, precursors are required to manufacture fentanyl. Those typically are, procured from India, China. And if there's kind of some kind of disruption where they can't get that, the cartels might pivot and try to tinker around and find new ways to bridge that gap and continue to produce fentanyl in novel ways. One thing too, anytime there's changes to the supply, we're always going to see, a higher risk for overdose. So if there's BTMPS in our supply, that's kind of going to make the purity, so to speak, of the supply lower, so that individuals are going to have decreased tolerance to their opioids. And then once the supply, quote unquote, goes back to normal, they're at risk for overdose due to decreased tolerance. And like I said, we haven't heard much about BTMPS lately. I would say the end of 2024, it kind of fell off the supply in Washington. We've heard, might still be there a little bit, and we've heard scattered reports here and there from other Western states of the presence of it. Okay, carfentanil. This is one we've been hearing a lot about and fielding quite a bit of questions about. It's an extremely potent synthetic opioid, very potent, and luckily we're not really seeing it here in Washington. It's a little bit more prevalent on the East Coast, but it's still uncommon. We did have a recent report of a pill seizure in California. So, that's something to keep an eye out for. The case with trends is things can change really rapidly. So we're always trying to keep our ear to the ground to see, who's seeing what. But this information is going to come from King County ME as well. Again, this is going to be fatality data, so it's not exactly representative of the general supply out there, but they've indicated, at least for King County, kind of rare isolated events. So in 2024, there were maybe 6 fatal overdoses that had carfentanil as a contributing substance to death. And in 2025, we've had 1, now maybe 2. But this is preliminary data and we're waiting for confirmation. And the image on the right is a picture of the sample from 2025 that potentially had carfentanil.
One thing to remember, carfentanil, what it is allowing the drug dealers to do is to stretch their product. Instead of putting X amount more fentanyl in the product, they can use less carfentanil. Again, they do not want to cause fatalities. They want to cause addiction. So they're basically spreading their product, and they can spread it more with carfentanil by putting less in each amount that's going on the street.
Right. So if carfentanil is say 200 times more potent than fentanyl, you shouldn't take that to mean that the supply that's produced with carfentanil is 200 times stronger. They're just going to it's not going to be a 1-for-1 swap. So that's carfentanil. So some source state information, like I said, in terms of trafficking, we're on the I-5 corridor. We kind of always consider what trends we're seeing in neighboring areas, because it either might inform what we're going to get or tell us what, in the case of Canada, might be going there, but not quite. So this comes from qualitative interviews that we do with our partners. Honestly, the trends are the same that we've been seeing. It's going to be ups and downs and fentanyl purity, changes to the quality of supply, and increases in cocaine. But this is just some recent stuff they told us. So Oregon also seeing a very large increase in cocaine. Partners in Arizona have reported less fentanyl seizures and oddly an increase in pharmacy robberies. Again, I don't think that's incredibly widespread, but in the county in which our partner operates. California decrease in fentanyl as well as fewer seizures. They're seeing similar problems as we are in terms of the quality, the variability in quality. Increase in cocaine as well, and they had a recent BTMPS and carfentanil seizure. So we'll have to see if that was kind of a one-off or if it ends up panning out into something, more akin to a trend. But for now, those are just isolated incidences. British Columbia, we work really closely with them. The big kind of takeaway here, because I know it's a concern for a lot of people and kind of a misconception, we are not having fentanyl trafficked from Canada into the US. Their fentanyl is locally produced. So meaning in Canada, they produce all of their fentanyl for kind of Canadian users, so to speak, and they have a hard time even keeping up with the appetite for fentanyl there. So their local production kind of barely keeps up with the need for it there. Their fentanyl is not moving south into Washington. Another thing, they frequently have benzodiazepines in their powder, and street level purity for fentanyl there averages around 16%, so not that much different than here.
One of the main things we do that comes south from British Columbia is MDMA. Most of the stuff that's going north is through Washington is going to be cocaine and methamphetamine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so getting into kind of some broad strokes in terms of production and just the economics. Caveat here, there's a lot of variance within these realms. These are just kind of, broad strokes. So fentanyl production, like we've talked about, to produce fentanyl, you need kind of precursors. Typically, those precursors are going to be procured from China or India, and they kind of make their way to Mexico in various ways. A lot of times just normal mail packages via air. And then once it's there, that fentanyl is going to be produced in labs in Mexico. I have, kind of a picture of what that typically looks like. After production, it's going to be packaged into kilogram blocks or pills to then be trafficked into the United States. Once it's smuggled across the border, it's then going to be destined for different trafficking routes by DTOs. DTOs is drug trafficking organizations. Once it kind of hits its regional hub or its destination, then mid-level dealers, there's really different tiers within kind of the DTO structure, and I think maybe Tim might speak to that later. But at its destination, those mid-level dealers, right? So it's not kind of the drug trafficking organizations themselves, will add their cuts, their binders, their adulterants, and then package it into smaller quantities for lower level kind of street dealers. And then that fentanyl will be sold at the street level to users. So obviously there's a lot of steps here. There's a lot of places it can get kind of stepped on, so to speak, and there's just a long journey that it makes. So looking specifically at pills, I'm sure we've all seen this image. It's from the DEA. Kind of the takeaway here, right, is that fake and authentic pills, oxycodones, the M30s, are really like virtually indistinguishable from one another. And to kind of get there, we're just going to take that powder and add our binder and then press it into pills using a pill press. So there's varying capacity for pill presses. Most like large scale pressing that happens in Mexico is going to be with an industrial press, which I have an image of. And not a lot of those have been seized locally in Washington or the US. Most of that large scale pressing is going to happen in Mexico. But there's also smaller presses that people can use to make smaller batches. And then these M30 like dyes or stamps are then used to make them look like the oxycodones. The M30 stamps and the presses are typically bought online from China. Just some pictures. On the left, that's going to be an example of an industrial press. You can kind of see all of the powder and the pills surrounding it. This is going to be a smaller kind of individual press. It has a little hand crank right here, so you're just going to crank that manually. This is an example of a stamp that you would use to give it the M30 appearance.
One thing I want to say about the pills is coming from working on the East Coast and coming out here in 2021. I never saw M30 pills on the streets of the East Coast cities until I came out here, which just tells you everything is very regional and taste and habits very widely, state to state, county to county. But it wasn't until recently they started seeing M30s on the East Coast. They're predominantly powder.
Mhm. Absolutely, yeah, trends are very regional. Again, this is just kind of some images about fentanyl production. You know, I think Tim pointed out to me a lot of times when people who don't work in this world hear the word lab, like fentanyl lab, you kind of imagine this like big industrial, very sterile space where the drugs are being produced. And this is really this was from investigative work by Reuters. This is really what a lab kind of looks like. A lot of these are in and around the Sinaloa area in Mexico, and over here we have powder being kind of dried out to then be turned into those M30s.
And those are probably the Reuters chemists and technicians doing that. Ordinarily, they wouldn't be wearing hazmat suits.
That's a good point. Yeah.
They're out there in blue jeans and a t-shirt.
Even this is kind of more precaution. Yeah. Okay, getting into cocaine. Like I said, you know, all-time high in 2023. And just to point out that all-time high of production we saw in 2023, that grew a third from 2022. And I mean, we can only assume it's gotten higher. First,
It was approximately in 2023, I think it was almost 3,000 metric tons of cocaine produced in the mainly in Colombia, also Peru, also other a couple other countries, with Colombia being the main producer.
yeah, a lot of it happens in Colombia. Our first step is going to be the coca leaves. This is where it comes from. So those coca leaves, just to give you kind of some perspective on scope and scale of what it takes, 400 kilograms of coca leaves are required to make 1 kilogram of cocaine. So you have people kind of harvesting these leaves, transporting them and shredded. So they're kind of mulled over for a couple of days, almost like the process of making wine. All these leaves are going to be together. Someone's going to be stepping on them, treading on them to get that extraction process going. Then these leaves are going to be soaked in gasoline, you know, water, acid, bleach, different solvents to extract the drug or extract the alkaloids. And then we're going to have like a coca paste that's then filtered and processed to isolate the cocaine base. So kind of in this process, each sort of toxic additive or chemical that goes into it, it's going to become more and more concentrated. After this is filtered and processed, it's purified with acetone, hydrochloric acid, and ether to create powdered cocaine, which is what is trafficked out of Colombia and into the U.S. An optional last step that might happen, you know, on the user level is then turning this into cocaine base or crack cocaine. So a user might take maybe a street dealer, it depends, powdered cocaine and process it with baking soda and water to then make crack cocaine.
But by a street dealer, if I can cook that crack the cocaine, I can stretch my supply even further because it's so addictive and unfortunately keeps the users coming back.
Absolutely. So that's kind of broad strokes for our production. I'm going to kick it over to Mike now, just to talk about kind of the economics and from start to finish the sort of profit and money that we're looking at.
And like she said, the worldwide guesstimate for the drug market or drug business is about $500 billion. It does make up a bulk of the income generated for organized crime throughout the world, international and local. So basically what I'm going to do here is just kind of go over the basics. The prices obviously will vary and depending on your location, availability and what's going on. So I'm going to keep it really simple. For fentanyl powder, generally, like she said, the purity coming across from Mexico is about 50%. Now it costs about $200 to make a kilo in Mexico. It is sold here on the streets, let's say for about $20,000, which are kind of similar across the West Coast right now for a kilo. If I get it at 50%, then I can cut that product and make 5 kilograms of fentanyl powder to put on the streets. And from there, what I'll do is just a mid-level user, if I'm selling in ounce quantities, I'm basically making 176 ounces of fentanyl powder at 10% purity. A package those in 1 ounce packages, and then I can sell them on the streets for about $1,000 per bag. Now, that comes out to about $176,000 off my $20,000 investment. And I minus that, so it's 156 profit. Now we take that, that's just your base process. There may be some overhead, et cetera, but that's just the basics right there. Just on a 1 kilogram powder coming from Mexico and the money being made by, say, a mid-level dealer. Now, as that product continues down the line, everybody's going to put their tax on that and make more money off of that. Buying in bulk is the number one way of lowering your cost. But that just gives you an idea how much money is being made off just 1 kilo of fentanyl powder here in Washington. Now we'll go to fentanyl pills. 1 kilogram of powder in Mexico makes about 1 million pills at 2% purity. Now, if I'm a mid-level dealer again, I can buy 50,000 pills at 50 cents a pill for $25,000. And I turn around and I'll sell those 50 bags at 1,000 pills per bag. We call that a boat, for about $1,500 per bag. That makes $75,000. My profit is going to be $50,000 just off those my $25,000 investment. And your overhead's probably a little bit less when you're dealing with pills because you're not cutting or putting extra cuts into it. It's already ready made, so you're just putting it into bags.
Yeah, it's a lot more straightforward than powder.
Similar with cocaine, you can get a cost of a kilogram in Colombia or Peru is between $1,000 and $1,500. Mid-level dealers can buy a kilogram here for about $20,000. Though, if you're buying in bulk again, you're going to get it at a cheaper price, maybe say $15,000, $16,000 per kilogram. And once again, those prices are very similar to what we're seeing here in Southern California. That is about half of what I was paying for it working in Baltimore just over 2-3 years ago. So as you can see, the prices have gone down and the amounts have gone up. Basically, what I'll do is I'll take that cocaine, and once again, I'll bag it into ounces, and I'll sell those ounces for about $1,000 each. And once again, I'm making about a $15,000 profit on that cocaine. Now, the cocaine that's coming in is about 70% pure, and what we're seeing on the streets is about 50%. So there is some cutting going on, so I could probably stretch my profit a little bit further by putting cuts on my cocaine. Or I could even stretch it further by cracking it, rocking it up and selling as crack.
All righty, drug trafficking and transportation, again, just broad strokes, and get over to Tim.
Thanks, Mike and Amanda. So yeah, broad strokes. I'm gonna touch briefly on some transportation and concealment methods. And again, we're talking the main drugs that are causing the most havoc in our communities: methamphetamine, cocaine, fentanyl, heroin to a degree. And then how are most people transporting it and concealing it? There's dozens of different ways, many dozens of different ways. Somebody's always going to come up with a brighter idea of how to move dope. So I'm just going to hit the highlights and not get into a whole lot of detail. So to start with, as far as concealment goes, and we're talking, most of the time we're talking about passenger cars and commercial trucks. So semi, tractor trailers, passenger cars, could be a rented car, could be a privately owned car, and how most of the main ways that they're moving dope and concealing it. And one of the main current trends, specifically domestically within the United States, once the drugs make it into the U.S., is what we call suicide loads, which means they don't take any effort to conceal it. They put it in a backpack or a duffel bag or a suitcase, back seat, throw it in the trunk, and then just hope they don't get stopped by the police. The next step up from that, and there's a picture of it there to the right, is natural voids within a vehicle. So throughout whatever vehicle you're driving, there's all sorts of natural voids in the bumpers, in the door panels, might be in the spare tire compartment, even utilizing things like the gas tank or the air filters and the engine compartment. There's lots of different places you can hide drugs to to conceal it. You got to pull some door panels off, but not a whole lot of dismantling of the car. And then a next step up from that, the most sophisticated methods we see are concealment built traps. So somebody who knows what they're doing actually builds a secret compartment somewhere in the car. They've got usually some sort of elaborate trigger mechanism. You put the emergency brake on and left turn signal and turn on the windshield wipers, and then a door pops out from the dashboard. And usually these are, again, what I'm talking about is, loads of like 5-10 kilos or more of these drugs. So, of course, if you want to get into the mail system, planes, there's people that are body carrying, internal or external. Leave that to your imagination. There's within the mail system parcels. If people are, maybe shipping toys or household goods or some sort of decor where they'll build a fake little compartment inside a vase and stick some drugs in there. That's going to be smaller quantities usually, not the bulk. With tractor trailers, of course, they'll do the suicide loads, they'll do the concealed traps, they'll do the body panels and stuff like that in commercial trucks. For international shipments, usually they'll also do, cover loads. And a popular one is produce. So if you got a load of apples, they'll, put 100 kilos in the bottom of a bin of apples. If they really want to get crazy with it, they might shape them into little spheres and paint them red so that they kind of look like apples if you're not looking too closely. It doesn't fool the dogs, doesn't usually fool the x-rays, but if they've got lots of bright ideas. So as far as the luggage, well, buses and trains too. We don't see them as often. Actually, we've had a couple of good seizures lately on buses. Usually it's just thrown in the luggage. If you've ridden a bus or a train domestically, they don't ask a lot of questions. There's no x-rays. But you're on a bus full of a bunch of other people and you might get stopped and have the police look it over.
And one of the things in getting to this, what's happened here recently with the changes at the border, they've moved more towards multiple different loads instead of larger loads and more concealment traps. So to lessen their chances of losing a major load, they're sending more of a shotgun approach, where they're sending multiple different smaller loads through mules through the ports of entry, commercials, using commercial vehicles or passenger cars.
Kind of an army of ants approach. Okay, so I'll start off with the synthetic drugs, fentanyl, methamphetamine. The precursor chemicals, like Amanda said, come from China, sometimes come from India. They're made in industrial, commercial facilities there. They're shipped by and large to Mexico on commercial cargo, air cargo, maritime cargo. Nothing super secret about it. The cartels take control of it in the interior of Mexico, and they synthesize it into the finished product. As we showed you pictures before, those aren't professional factories or labs. These are dusty warehouses and barns and camps out in the middle of the jungle or the woods someplace. Once they've got a finished product, they'll move it up towards the border. There's warehouses. They'll kind of warehouse it up on the Mexican side of the border, prepare it to get it across the border. Getting it across the border, there's, again, dozens of ways to get it across the border. The most common ways are through tractor trailers and passenger cars. There's, I think, 6 million trucks crossing the Southwest border every year, just 1 million at Otay Mesa, south of San Diego alone in a year. There's 39 million cars crossing the Southwest border, 15 million of them are San Isidro. So there's a lot of cars, a lot of trucks crossing that border, and Customs and Border Patrol can only check a fragment of those. And they've got to keep traffic moving. So it gets warehoused, moved across. In addition, there's lots of creative ways they can take it out to sea and around in fishing boats and motorboats and jet skis. They can fly it over the border in little airplane, light aircraft, ultralights, drones can carry a couple of kilos at a time. If you get away from the border fence, you can hike it across, you can have an ATV, you can climb over the fence, you can tunnel under the fence. The fence definitely slows them down and gives Border Patrol a chance to respond. But they've come up with some pretty ingenious ways to get it across the border. But trucks and cars are the main route. Once they get it across the U.S. border, it's warehoused again in Southern California or Arizona. Load might get broken up, redistributed, maybe stepped on at that point to get distributed throughout the country. And a courier will come down to those warehouses or those locations in Southern California and Arizona, pick it up, take it up to Washington State again, trucks and cars. And one thing I wanted to point out about the whole system is that the cartels and the drug trafficking organizations are really siloed. So it's a specific organization that handles each little segment of this, each part of the movement, and or are a part of the organization. And the guy that drives it across the border doesn't know where the lab is, and he doesn't know who's going to come pick it up, and he doesn't know where it's going to go. And that's for an obvious reason, so that if anything happens, if anybody gets arrested, somebody's listening to phones, then nobody can know too much about what's going on. Cocaine. So most of the cocaine that is consumed or distributed in Washington State is grown. The coca leaves are grown in Colombia. Colombian cartels kind of control that growth for those crops. They synthesize it or process it into finished product, into cocaine in Colombia. It's moved into Mexico. Again, variety of methods, Eastern Pacific, Caribbean. They can fly commercial air, commercial cargo, air cargo, light aircraft, maritime cargo, fishing boats, cocaine-based, or Colombian-based fishing vessels might go out into the Eastern Pacific, meet up with a Mexican-based fishing vessel. They'll transfer the load there. And of course, the sexy one is the little semi-submersibles. That just have a really low profile. A lot of them now are not manned. They might be remote controlled or following some sort of pre-programmed route to be intercepted by somebody who's going to pick it up. Once it gets into Mexico, kind of the same route, moves up to the border, gets warehoused, wait for a courier to get it across one way or the other, get it to the U.S. side, take it up to Washington State, in our case by tractor trailer or passenger car. Heroin, most of the heroin that's distributed in Washington State is grown in the opium poppies are grown in Mexico. DEA has a special testing lab, does experiments where they'll go out and grow coca leaves or pull coca leaves from specific regions in South America, or opium poppies from specific regions in Mexico or South America or West Asia, and then go through the whole process of synthesizing it into or processing it into the final product. And then they look at that signature, the chemical signature of that product. And then they can tell from a sample that say we buy here in Seattle where that coca leaf was grown or where the opium poppy was grown. So it gets processed there in Mexico into heroin, same process after that. As far as regional distribution, so it's going to make its way up the I-5 corridor primarily. There's lots of other routes. They can take whatever route they want, but it's usually going to happen by car or truck. There are some loads happening, like I said, by bus and train. Now they come up the I-5 corridor, hit Portland. Some of those loads get split off from Portland, go through the gorge over to Yakima, Tri-Cities, from Tri-Cities up to Spokane, and then from Spokane out to North Idaho and Western Montana. A lot of those loads happen by train too. Amtrak's kind of known as the Fentanyl Express in Montana. It's a good way to get it long distances across there. Of course, keeps going after Portland up to Tacoma, Seattle, Everett, and gets distributed throughout the rest of the state to smaller communities there. At each one of these steps, it kind of stops it'll get put in a stash house, maybe the load broken down, stepped on, add adulterant, stretch it a little bit, lose a little bit of its purity. People add their profit margin to it. Washington's also kind of a transit zone. Did you have something, Mike? Washington's also kind of a transit zone to get to Alaska. Drugs go for a lot of money, more money in Alaska than they do here. And that can happen a lot of ways. The main two are probably commercial air passengers and mail. So it's easier to mail something up to Alaska than to get a lot of ways. But this time of year, there's a lot of barges taking cargo up to Alaska. There's ferries going from Bellingham up to Alaska. There's fishing vessels going up there. All of these are potential methods to move whatever kind of dope, whether it's meth, cocaine, fentanyl, to Alaska. The other transit area that we're going to is Canada. And that could happen, again, tractor trailers, passenger cars to a certain extent, light aircraft. Obviously, a lot of you guys have seen the US-Canadian border. There's not much standing in your way. Personal watercraft, canoes, kayaks, motorboats, whatever. You can hike it across. A lot of these drugs, specifically cocaine and methamphetamine, are worth more in Canada, but then they're worth even more in places like Hong Kong and Australia. And so we see certain amounts of cocaine and meth leaving Canada, Port of Vancouver, bound for Australia and Hong Kong, and certain other places, New Zealand, Oceania, various places. So.
Yeah, and there's like Tim said, a lot of profit to be had in Australia and New Zealand, Hong Kong, especially for the stimulants. Mike, if you want to.
Yeah, it's the same for the fentanyl, the same fentanyl pills in Western Montana. If I can get one pill I'm buying, selling for $1 here, I can sell for $40 on the reservations in Montana, or up in Alaska, pay $100 a pill. So it varies, but once you get further away from your main distribution sites, the more you're going to make.
And that's everything we have for you guys. This is our contact information. I think I said this earlier, but Mike and I, we serve all of Washington State. So if there's anyone on the call who wants to collaborate, wants more information, had questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And with that, I will stop sharing and probably kick it back over to Alex.
Perfect. Well, thank you, all three of you. That was very informative. We have a few minutes left, so folks, please ask questions if you have them. I had jotted down a couple questions and thoughts on my end. First, actually, is a comment and a bit of appreciation. I appreciate that how you all framed basically some myth busting around this idea of fentanyl contaminated cocaine and other substances, and you just kind of let the data speak for itself. I think we're in a day and age where there can be so much intentional or unintentional, like oh my goodness, I cannot speak. Overhype. That's the one. There we go. Overhyping of the reality. So I really appreciate that. One question I had on this idea of fentanyl contaminated other substances, just anecdotally, I get comments or questions if I'm out doing outreach for the Poison Center. Folks will be like, "Oh, I'm hearing that folks are vaping it now," or "Oh, I'm seeing or hearing about fentanyl contaminated cannabis or marijuana." And I just want to bounce that to you all. Are you seeing any reports of fentanyl showing up in cannabis or being used through vape devices?
No, we are not. Specifically to the vape, I mean, I think we've established it's not really, the burning points are so different with vapes and fentanyl that kind of getting a high from that isn't feasible. To your point, Alex, I will say, like, our job is to check the data and see if it's there. However, like I said previously, trends do evolve and change quickly. So we always want to hear what people are, seeing or think they're seeing in the community. But in terms of fentanyl being laced into cannabis, into vapes, I mean, like I said, polysubstance use is big. That might be an indication of someone kind of messing with their drugs in their personal use. A big thing too is stigma. A lot of times if someone's a stimulant user or they're not using, harder substances, maybe they are using opioids, but they don't want to admit to it. So they might kind of deny that usage. But on any kind of substantial, large scale, we're not seeing fentanyl laced in other substances.
We have never seen it confirmed, either a lab report. We've always said, hey, there is fentanyl in the marijuana. We've never seen anything that's been confirmed.
Mhm.
The fentanyl will burn before that point. So it's basically you're wasting your money again by putting fentanyl onto your marijuana as your dealer. It's just a waste. So you got to remember this from an economic standpoint when you're talking with dealers.
I will also say that we didn't get into this, but there's a certain amount of kind of, valuability or inconsistencies with testing methods, right? So a lot of times law enforcement, sometimes they use like true narc, and different kind of like testing, on the supply when they're there. It's not 100% accurate. Field testing, not 100% accurate. So maybe something popped positive falsely, and then that kind of gets perpetuated into a myth. Similarly with drug test strips, sometimes high concentrations of fentanyl might, cause certain things to to get that opposite. Sorry, been talking a lot. But certain different brands of drug test strips might have some inconsistencies that falsely pop positive for fentanyl. So you want to kind of cross-check information with as many different data sources as you can, because they all have their gaps and their problems.
One thing we're also seeing is everyone says there's carfentanil everywhere. One of the things we're also looking at is working with King County Medical Examiner's Office and looking at their statistics and their urinalysis. We're finding they see a large amount of carfentanil in the urine. However, when they do the blood testing, there is no carfentanil. And that is due to the fact that carfentanil will pop positive. It will pop positive carfentanil if there's a large amount of fentanyl in the system. So,
right. But even that's not universal, right? That's just kind of what we recently discovered with their testing and their samples. So there's so many caveats kind of there, in terms of trends. But yeah, we always like to hear what people are seeing and, access as much information as we can.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now I know we are about at time, or actually a minute over time. It's up to you all if you want to answer a couple more questions, or if you'd like me to send you those questions over email and we can post them.
We're happy to take some. Yeah.
that's fine.
All right. Well, y'all are such great, good attitude with all this. Appreciate it. So I've got a question here. I know there has been increases in overdoses in Yakima County, this individuals in Kittitas County, as they issue spike alerts. When that happens, do you get notified of the substances that are causing increased spike alerts in overdoses?
It kind of depends. So like I mentioned earlier, we work with a program called ODMAP, which tracks overdoses. I'm sure whoever asked the question already knows this. And then that platform generates those spike alerts when an area is in increased overdose activity. Part of those spike alerts, typically it's Mike's job. He's our drug intelligence officer. When we see that an area is in a spike, he'll get on the phone and reach out to his contacts there and say, hey, what have you seen? What do we think is going on there? Sometimes they know a substance that's happening in conjunction with the spike. A lot of times they don't. Most of the time, it's what we talked about, just those changes in fentanyl supply and variability. So for messaging for spike responses, we like to keep it brief. Just changes to the supply can lead to increased overdoses, but it depends. Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. It's almost always going to be variation in fentanyl.
We try to keep that information within the governmental organizations, try to figure out, instead of putting that information out into the public sphere, we want to keep it very simple. This is what we're seeing. And try to identify those things, because obviously testing takes a while.
Yeah.
And we don't want to start some kind of
widespread panic.
Oh my gosh, there's something out there.
Right.
Until we really know.
Right.
Yeah, my personal background is public health, and I very much appreciate the caution and risk communication. So it's not like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere, and then folks just take that little soundbite out of context and run with it. I appreciate that. All right, I got another question. Have you ever seen reports of 3D printers being used for pill pressing?
Yeah, we've heard of it. It's not that hard to get a real pill press. So we've heard of it. It's more of like hypothesized that it could happen, but we've never actually seized one or seen one in the wild. So
fair. I appreciate that kind of
3D
answer.
printed guns.
Oh. Say again?
More often see 3D printed guns.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, if they got a 3D printer, they're gonna make guns with it instead of pill presses, probably.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that kind of answer of like, well, it's theoretically possible, but the simpler solution is right here.
Why would you?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, a couple more. Folks, y'all are really popular. A lot of appreciation in the chat box here. And then I'm also seeing, are overdose deaths tested for BTMPS, or is that testing limited to crime labs?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that's something we would know kind of with the ME. I don't know that King County ME was testing for BTMPS. And
What we've seen is the labs on both ends are doing, at least in King County Medical Examiner's Office is looking there, and as well as the crime labs are also looking for BTMPS. Once again, the thing to remember is BTMPS is not a driver. It's going to be the fentanyl. So BTMPS is just we believe to be a part of the precursor or production in Mexico, and try to identify different ways to make precursors and use for fentanyl production. As the precursor availability has decreased in Mexico, they're trying to come up with new innovative ways to make fentanyl. So they're looking at these different chemicals, and we believe BTMPS is one of those byproducts, or they're using that chemical.
Mhm. And like Mike said, it's always going to be the fentanyl. You know, when we look at different adulterants or different kind of smaller one-off things that are cropping up, it's still the fentanyl that's killing people.
Right. All right, I'm going to have this be the final question, so we don't have to hold you hostage in this session. Is there a place to find this information, such as updates, trends, basically any sources you would recommend? Yes, these are. If this publication says this, you can trust it.
Right. So there's a couple. Like I kicked us off with, there's so much different data you use to get a sense of this. We've talked a lot depending on what field you work in, what agency you're with. King County Medical Examiner's Office does really great data collection, and they send out statewide fatality bulletins. So they're a great resource. You can reach out to them to receive that bulletin if you're kind of working in this field. ADAI at UW has a really great community drug checking program up and running. So we'll periodically check in on that dashboard. They test community samples and see what substances come back in those samples. So I'd really recommend them. And in general, they do a lot of great kind of education and webinars on these topics. Like I said, Mike and I, it's kind of our bread and butter to do drug trends. So, we create bulletins and drug trend reports. So if you're an applicable agency, reach out to me and we can see about getting you signed up for those reports. Or some other ones.
And she mentioned earlier, if you want a worldwide perspective, the UN drug report that was just released, and most of the data was through 2023 or 2024, but it does a really good job of telling a story regionally and worldwide on what's going on with the drug supply and drug markets.
No, it's amazing. You can spend hours with that report, and they break it down by substances too. So highly recommend.
Oh, I was gonna say, if there's for law enforcement, reach out to me and I can put you on some lists there. But it would have to be law enforcement.
All right, sounds good. I'm getting a request to see contact information. You had it in that last slide, folks. We'll post that slide. Oh, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I can screen share it real quick, or do you want me to?
Oh, sure. Yeah. You can have it up while I do my little wrap up spiel, so folks can snag that one last time. And then, folks, we'll also be putting recordings of these sessions along with the slides and any accompanying materials. We'll embed that all in Whova. We can put that in the session descriptions and all that. So multiple ways to find this contact info. Amanda, Mike, Tim, I really appreciate all of you. Thank you for taking some time out of your day, taking time out of previous weeks to get all this prepared for us for this series. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for having us. It was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, folks who are still viewing, we'll have a short break and then we'll reconvene at 1:15. There are two sessions to choose between. One is on the Healthcare Authority's Friends for Life campaign update, so updates on that campaign. The other is all on community pharmacy and medications for opioid use disorder. Now, I know you can't be in both at the same time, but we are recording them, so you can always catch whatever you missed at a future date. Thanks, everyone, and hope to see you then. Bye.